My First Love is Psycho from 1960. Plot summary: a secretary on the run for embezzlement takes refuge at a secluded California motel owned by a repressed man and his overbearing mother. Directed by Hitchcock, starring Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh. So another big masterpiece of his. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, when I was a kid, knowing of Hitchcock, I really associated him strongly with the suspense and horror genres. Just that was the iconography that I was absorbing like as a young kid. And I'd seen the TV show was on Nick at Night, so I'd watch that every so often, which is definitely a lot of horror stuff in there. But this movie, I knew it existed. I was afraid to see it when I was a kid. I knew it was going to scare me, even though it was an old movie in black and white. Like these are all things as a child you feel like mean it can't be good or can't be scary or what have you. And I remember finally like sort of getting up the courage, I guess you could say, to actually watching the movie. And it definitely did scare me and still does to this day. Like it lived up to
Yeah.
what this in my mind, it was this thing that was going to be like the scariest movie. And, also my parents would talk about, oh, I remember seeing that in theaters and it was so scary. So it was this thing built up in my mind. And Hitchcock, even though, like you were saying, he's fun, he has like a fun, like kind of macabre, dark sense of humor. I did always associate him with horror. So that all made it even scarier. It's like, well, if he's like the master of horror, like this has got to be maybe the scariest movie ever made. And I saw it, as a young teen and loved it, and was scared by it. And it was hard for me to actually come back to it very often as a, until I was more an adult because it is so scary. It still scares me to this day. I think it's one of the scariest and creepiest movies in the way that he shot it. I think the black and white adds a lot of those elements, the score. We mentioned Bernard Herrmann. I think this is another just masterpiece in the
Mhm.
score. And there's a lot of other things I want to discuss when we get more into the movie itself. But I'm curious in terms of your first impressions. And did you have any, like I did, sort of expectation going into this, or did it have a reputation flying around? Maybe even when you were a kid, you said you knew of Hitchcock in India. I'm curious if this was one of the movies that was most associated with him for you.
I don't think I knew of this movie growing up, but yeah, as a teenager in my 20s, definitely knew it. And even once I started doing like a Hitchcock marathon of sorts, I avoided this movie for as long as I possibly could because of his reputation. And I was like, this is just too scary and too creepy. And horror is kind of not my genre
Right.
anyway.
Right.
So I just kind of avoided it. But then you watch it and of course it's scary, all those things that you know of, the shower sequence and what have you, it all lives up, it scares you, the jump squares and the
Hmm.
construction, the music, all of it works. But like with great horror movies, the few of them that I've seen, because I've not seen that many horror movies,
Yeah.
what really works is the psychology of it, like what is really going on and how creepy that is, and that's the stuff that stays with you. And so the same metaphor applies here as well, right? That you can come in and just be entertained by the jump scares and the thrills, or you could marvel at the movie making, or you could really wrestle with the psychology of what is happening, of relationships between sons and mothers, and just trauma and all sorts of things, which I'm sure we'll get into. So yeah, it works on all the levels. It really is a masterpiece in my mind. Like when I think of horror as a genre, or when I think of any kind of horror element in any movie made since, I always think of this movie. Like it's
Hmm.
sort of like a template. There are probably a few templatized movies in the horror genre. I'm no horror expert, but feels like this is definitely in that pantheon.
Absolutely. In terms of horror, it definitely was credited as creating the ground for the slasher movie. I mean, this is
Yeah.
really, you could make an argument this is the first one, even though there's been other sort of more like crystallized takes on it. And even down to the techniques of there's several point of view shots in this movie
Mm.
through the eyes of the killer, Anthony Perkins, when he's
Hmm.
peeping through the hole at her kind of getting changed, it's a first person point of view shot. And that is something that horror movies use all the time now.
Right.
Slasher movies, you're always seen from the point of view of the killer as, he or she's walking up on the victim, and Hitch is laying the groundwork for that too. And I think what also makes this movie scary for me, and actually might have been the reason why these types of movies are the scariest types of horror movies to me, is something we mentioned in our Long Legs episode, which was a couple episodes back, that
Hmm.
serial killers are terrifying to me. But once you start adding supernatural elements to it, I still love those types of movies, but they're not scary. And what
Right.
makes this movie, I think, so scary is this is a normal guy I mean, he's not normal, but he
He's
doesn't have
not normal.
powers. He doesn't have any powers.
No.
It's the trauma that was
Right.
created in his life turned him into a killer, which can happen to anyone. And the
Yeah.
situation is super normal. Someone just goes into a hotel and they're just checking in, nice guy there, whatever. It's like absolutely, it's again, it gets back to that ordinary circumstance with something extraordinary. But in this movie,
Right.
the extraordinary thing is, I don't want to say ordinary because psychopaths aren't ordinary, but it's human.
Yeah.
It's not anything supernatural. It's not a ghost. It's not, an alien. And that's what makes it so much more frightening to
And
me, at least.
effective.
And
Yeah.
effective, right? And
Yeah.
effective. And why I think as a kid it scared me and it still scares me today. And maybe is why I get scared more at those types of horror films than the ones with like,
Right.
a
Exactly.
supernatural being or a ghost or
Yeah.
something
Because
like
it's
that.
not real then. The stakes are
Right.
not immediately kind of brought down because you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is not real. But
Right.
like this is real. It can
Mm-hmm.
happen to
Mm-hmm.
anybody, actually.
Right, right. And that is what might and the ordinary, it's like she wasn't targeted for any particular reason in terms of the plot. I mean, I know you can say Hitchcock blonde and we can layer on all those things of why,
Hmm.
and the fact that she was, you could say she was committing a crime in the beginning of the movie.
Right.
The first half of the or the first third of the movie is the MacGuffin. It's an entire plot that just gets dropped almost immediately after
Hmm.
she gets killed. But you can say she's getting killed because she committed a crime, so it's like the penance and
Hmm.
bad people. But there's no real reason. He didn't target her. He didn't find her. She came to him and he's like, okay, like I'm gonna kill her. And that can happen also to anybody. Like she
Right.
didn't deserve this or cause this, I guess is kind of more what I'm trying to say. Just wrong person, wrong time. And
Exactly.
that could be anyone.
Exactly. Even though you could totally make a movie about what's going on with her, but
Hmm.
that's not the point. But it does matter. And that's sort of the nuance of his, right? Like you could have a MacGuffin that you throw away, but it has no deeper meaning or connectivity. But in all of his movies, even those things are thrown away, they are catalysts. They do kind of stay because you've seen this whole thing now, right? Like
Hmm.
you've seen this person commit a crime, have this kind of luxurious shower, trying to kind of wash her sins away, and
Hmm.
then be brutally murdered. You cannot not unsee that. You've
Right.
seen it now, right?
Hmm.
You're a part of it. And that's the other thing too. Like he's always playing with the audience. You've seen this now. So how can you sort of now just go about your normal life? You cannot. You're in it now. And that is why what happened to her, it matters, but it doesn't matter because now the world has changed. It's
Right.
almost like life before that and life after that.
Right, right. Similar to the last movies we discussed too, there's no, there's a, it's not a mystery for the audience. You know what happened, and now you're just
Mm-hmm.
watching the other characters, and the suspense is: are they going to get killed? Which some of them
Right.
do. Are they going to find out? I guess the mystery is sort of why Norman is the way he is, and
That
that
is a
that
mystery. Yeah.
that is a actually mystery that you do are invested in because you're like, what is going on? Like, is it the mom? If it's not, like, is it him? Why is it him? And then they give you enough that you can understand it, but they don't make it about that either. And a lot of the credit, I think, too, is due to Anthony Perkins's just absolutely incredible performance in this movie as
Totally.
Norman Bates, that he can play a normal guy, a troubled guy, and then a psycho. Like all in just sort of one
Mhm.
performance and make it believable that this could happen to, a person that goes through that that break because of all the things that he saw with his parents and what his mom did and his dad did and all the things they kind of hint at in the movie. But he is just absolutely the older I've gotten, the more I can appreciate the acting and what he's giving to this role instead of just be like scared of him.
Exactly. Yeah. Which again is sort of the brilliance of, I guess, Hitch, but also the actors he chose, right? Like this movie could just hang on the jump scares and the way the MacGuffin is treated, the technical brilliance. But if this performance is not grounding the entire piece, it wouldn't be a masterpiece.
Hmm.
The tone of the movie would be different. And there's just so many layers. Like you have to be on this journey with him to keep trying to guess what is going on with you. And you get glimpses, but you're never really sure. It's probably one of the most unsettling performances I've ever seen put on screen.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on the ending of the movie where stuff is sort of spelled out, which is atypical of Hitchcock, but I'm sure there's like a studio reason or something, you know.
Spelled out and like explaining,
Yeah.
oh, what happened to Norman and Well, it is interesting in terms of the MacGuffin part, though. They drop sort of the investigation into the money and
Right.
Marion getting killed and things. It's like all about Perkins. And the very last shot is they just cut to, okay, the car's getting out of the water. So maybe they found it. They don't explain the resolution of the MacGuffin part, but they
Hmm.
definitely do explain, to your point, more of Norman. And I think
Right.
without that context, and then I think the last shot of him in the police holding cell where he just like looks up at the camera and gives this just psychopathic look and stare and smile. It's just
Hmm.
absolutely incredible. But I
Oh.
think you need the cops to make it feel ordinary again at the end to make you afraid that, wait a second, there is no supernatural element. It wasn't the mom come back from the dead. You understand why he was quote unquote created, and then that is more terrifying because again, that could happen to anyone, or could be a lot of Norman Bateses being created out there too. So I think without that context is sort of my take on it. It wouldn't be as scary because there'd be almost too much ambiguity and the matter of factness of, oh, he was traumatized as a child because of this and now he turned into a killer. That is more terrifying than if they didn't really explain kind of what happened. But what is your take to that? Because you're right, it is a bit of an information dump by the cops at
Yeah.
the end.
I mean, looking at it from like, sitting here now, it sort of feels maybe a little too much of exposition dump
Hmm.
because yes, you need that context, but I don't know if it needed to be spelled out that literally. I mean, I'm sure Hitch is capable of communicating and conveying that in kind of a more subtle way that this is not supernatural. This is what happened without really sort of spelling it out the way it
Mm.
is. That said, though, I was reading about this and thinking about like when this movie came out, you know, psychiatry and psychology and mental health and all of this stuff was probably still pretty new, so
True, right. Or frowned upon or thought was
or
weird and
frowned upon or
people, right.
whatever. And our understanding into the human mind and psychology was still evolving, it still is evolving. So maybe at that time it needed to be spelled out even more, just
Mm.
so people really understood it, because otherwise you wouldn't. So in that sense, I think it makes sense. But yeah, just viewing it from today's lens, it did feel a little much because it does take you out of the movie, I think. Versus if it were just explaining, I'm no Hitch, obviously, who can be.
I thought you were in the beginning of the episode. You fooled me.
True, exactly. But yeah, if he had just done it like a way that you understand it, but it's not spelled out, I just feel like you will walk away, with like a slightly
Mm.
different head on your shoulders.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if part of it too, perhaps, was that the whole tone of this movie and sort of what he was going after was making like a B horror picture. Like he this was supposed to kind of be his take on like a trashy,
Hmm.
horror novel, which is why it does feel kind of cheap and exploitative a little bit, like an exploitation film,
Mhm.
but elevated because he's Hitchcock, he's elevated it. But I think the sort of the trappings of what you would need to do in a story like that, of just spell it out at the end, is sort of part of the formula, and maybe that is also something that he's playing around with. But then also, I think you could say this invented that formula in a way too. I mean, it's a police procedural mixed with like a serial killer film, and how many times has this been done now?
Yep.
A million. Like whole careers are built on people trying to rip this movie off. Or I shouldn't say that because that sounds cheap, but are influenced by this movie to start
Influenced
their
by
whole
it. Yeah.
careers is more of kind of what's going on here. So I wonder if that is sort of part of it where he's not making like a Spellbound, or which is his other film about like psychology, or his more of a trying to go after the higher art thing, especially at the time too. Horror was not seen as anything respectable whatsoever. So the
Yeah.
fact that he was even doing this it was hard to get finance in, I think, for this film too. Like, no, he had to cut the budget way down. Like studios weren't like,
Oh yeah.
why are you making a movie based on this really trashy book? Like, this is ridiculous. You're Alfred Hitchcock. Like, you just made Northwest, and Rear Window. Like, what are you doing? But I think he was just, again, his brilliance. He saw like what he could do with this story and change the game forever. I mean, that the thing about this movie too that is just every time I see it, like much like Northwest and a lot of the Hitch movies, is it feels so modern because
Hmm.
he created modern blockbuster cinema, or and that we're still craving from so much of this stuff. It doesn't feel like a quote unquote older movie that's paced in a certain
Hmm.
way, that is acted in a certain way, that is shot in a certain way. It just feels like this could have been made this year.
Yep.
Especially that shower scene, just it's
Oh,
hard to understand how revolutionary that was in terms of the fast cutting and everything because we're so used to that now. But that does feel like something anyone could have shot. this year and put into a movie and it would still be just as effective. And I think that's just, again, the thing that every time I see a Hitch movie, I'm just struck by how it just feels like it was made yesterday. Like when you
Yeah.
listen to a good song from a long time ago and you're like, oh, this could, like a Beatles track. It's like, oh, someone could have made this today. It doesn't feel, feels timeless. I think that is Hitch. And this movie especially. Not all of his movies,
Yeah.
but this one and North and Northwest as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. I know we've covered several masterpieces already, but this is the masterpiece category now. What is your masterpiece for Hitchcock? I mean, there's so many to choose from. What are you giving
Uh,
us today?
they keep coming.
Yeah.
But my
Hi there, it's Alex. If you like the review and discussion Karan and I just had, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Movies That Shaped Us, to get full episodes. Every other Wednesday, Karan and I review a new release and then discuss 6 other movies made by that film's actor or director and how they shaped us. Subscribe right now or follow our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts via the link in the description below. Hope you join us for the journey.